Welcome everyone to the 7th discussion about how China's global connections are made and how these are brokered. We've been holding these discussions for every month during the semester, last semester and this semester, and they take place every Wednesday at the time that it is right now, wherever you are. It's hosted at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. My name is Xis Vision, and I'm the principal investigator of the project Brokering China's Extraversion and Ethnographic Analysis of Transnational Arbitration. Today, we're lucky to have with us Elizabeth Economy and Shaun Breslin, two scholars whom I think you all know, whose books on China's rise on the global geopolitical scene have inspired some discussions, and I expect there's more to come, especially as Elizabeth Economy's book will be read by more people. Which it's about to come out. The discussion will be chaired by Amy Qin, national correspondent for the New York Times, who covers politics and society in China. Amy Qin, I'll let you introduce the speakers and their work further. Thanks to everyone for coming, and over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to the University of Oslo for hosting us for this very, what I think is going to be a very interesting panel tonight. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, when I saw that the subject of this panel was China has arrived as a geopolitical superpower, it got me thinking a little bit about what I've seen and kind of been reporting on as a China correspondent for the Times over the last few years. I was in Beijing from 2012 to 2020. And my last reporting trip in China before, as many of you may know, a group of US journalists, including myself, got expelled, was to Wuhan. And I remember that the night that I got evacuated from Wuhan, and I was at the airport, and had been a crazy week of reporting on what at the time was still this very mysterious virus. Li Wenliang, the doctor in Wuhan, died. And I remember looking and scrolling through my phone and just feeling like, what's going to happen in China? It felt like this was going to be a huge turning point. And as we all know now, within a month or so, China rebounded. They got the virus under control. The virus, the outbreak spread around the world. And that night when everyone was wondering, is this the end of the CCP as we know it, that obviously did not materialize. So I bring up that example to talk about how it's so difficult for people like us who pay attention to China to know, to sort of remember that we need to keep on both the short term, watch how to make sense of these kind of everything that's changing very quickly, but at the same time, these longer term developments. I remember when I first moved to Beijing in 2012, that was right before Xi Jinping had come to power. And, obviously his time in office has been very consequential for China. We have seen it go from, well, I think we'll hear our panelists talk today about what's happened over the last decade. And, the ground just sort of shifted very slowly, it felt like, in a way. We didn't know it until one day we kind of woke up in 2018, 2019, and we were like, oh wow, this is very different from how it felt in 2012 when we first came here. So that's all to say that we're very lucky today to have both Shaun and Elizabeth with us to kind of help us try to make sense and share with us their thoughts. Something, they've been thinking about this for a long time, and they've written two magnificent books about this, which I would recommend that you all read. Just to give you a little bit of an outline of what the session is going to be like today, we'll first hear from Shaun, just a brief presentation from him about his thoughts, and then we'll hear from Liz, and then we will open it up for questions. And if you have any questions, you can write to me, and I will do my best to get through as many as possible. And we will, Liz will be leaving us a little bit earlier, and so we will prioritize questions for her. And then we will be ending promptly at, well, it's different times for everyone right now, but in about 80 minutes. So just to introduce our two speakers, we have Shaun Breslin, who is a professor of politics and international studies at the University of Warwick and co-editor of the Pacific Review. Having first studied in China in 1984, he has spent the last 3.5 decades trying to understand the political economy of contemporary China and China's place in the world, with a side interest in studies of comparative regional integration. His latest book, China Risen, Studying Chinese Global Power, was published by Bristol University Press earlier this year. And our second discussant today is Elizabeth Economy, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a former senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy and the author of several excellent books, including The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, The River Runs Black, The Environmental Challenge to China's Future, and most recently, The World According to China. So without further ado, let us turn to Shaun. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. Behind my head here, you can see a picture of Shanghai from where I used to get the bus back to my flat when I was living in Shanghai in 2018. And I was back there again in January 2020, just about when you were getting evacuated out of Wuhan. And I got on the crowded subway line to get to Hongqiao and flew down to Hong Kong and congratulated myself on having escaped whatever it was that was brewing in China. And boy, I got that one wrong, didn't I? And here we are some time later. Rather than being with you in person, being online. I'm not particularly good on Zoom because we use Teams, but I guess it's hopefully pretty much the same sort of setup. So hopefully you can see that screen there, the picture of the book cover, which they chose that picture rather than one that I'd taken myself. So I feel a little bit slighted by that, but so it goes. So what I'm going to talk about is not so much the book as to what drove me to write the book and some of the issues I think that that emerged in the process of writing it for the way that we study China. Because actually, I mean, it says studying Chinese global power. I really wanted to write a whole book on how we actually study China and how different modes of studying China influence the sort of questions we ask, the evidence we look for, and how we pass and understand and disseminate that evidence. But in the end, that got compacted down to one little part of it. And the book is really based on various ideas that have been hanging around my head for quite some time and came to fruition because I was lucky enough to get a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship. And I really should waste no opportunity to thank Leverhulme because it's a great opportunity. They buy your teaching out for 3 years and just leave you clear to get on with the things that you've not been able to do. So the book was really based on 3 long-term enduring interests, and then of course alongside the importance of change, because Amy's dead right. I mean, I got it wrong in 2012. I thought that the way the Communist Party institutionalized itself and its processes of leadership transition, I never saw what has happened coming at the time. But let me explain the enduring interests more than anything else. So there are 3 of them. So a number of years ago, I was asked to go and talk to somebody who was going to be sent by the British government to work in the British Embassy in Beijing, along with another scholar based in the UK, sort of thing they do on a regular basis, sort of ask you to give your ideas, opinions, what you think the big issues are at the time. And as I was on the train going down to London, I thought, right, the dominant discourse of China at the moment is how it's going to become a superpower, its inevitable continued rise to power and its superpower status. So I thought what I'd do was try and puncture some of the expectations of this inevitable rise to superpower. And what I would do instead was point to the various domestic challenges facing the Chinese leadership that might impact on the nature of China's rise and might even derail it. I thought, it's important to sort of bring a sense of reality. So we went to a nice little Chinese restaurant, and unfortunately for me, my colleague went first, and I was beaten to the punch by him, who dived in to counter what he thought was the dominant narrative at the time. And what he thought was the dominant narrative was that China was on the verge of an impending collapse, a financial collapse, the collapse at least of the economy, probably of the Communist Party, and perhaps the whole country. So he said, why is everybody talking about China's collapse? Why is everybody exaggerating the challenges that the leadership faced? And he said, instead of this, we should be focusing instead on the neglected story of China's rise to global power. And so I was absolutely stuck for anything to say at this point. But it's not the only time that these two very radical understandings of China's immediate future have been evident. I remember a couple of years ago actually talking to Chinese academics, and in the morning at an international relations department being told about how Chinese wisdom now is going to be the basis of China's solutions for the world. And in the afternoon talking to a few economists who were really worried about bankruptcy of local governments. And David Government, my old tutor, emailed me not so long ago and said, was he alone in wondering how China was both destined for global leadership and imminent collapse at the same time? And so one of the things that really inspired me, and I've been thinking about for quite a long time, is how do we end up with such radically different interpretations of the immediate future of where China's going? And it's not something that is new. And in part, I do think that some of it is doing exactly what I set out to do, and I think what my colleague tried to do when we met with the British official, is to try and sort of puncture expectations. And Jerry Siegel, way back in 1999, wrote a very famous article called "Does China Matter?" And I knew Jerry well at the time. And actually, if you read through what he was saying, it said, of course, China matters, but perhaps not quite as much as some people are saying it does. But that's not a very snappy headline. So I went with "Does China Matter?" And perhaps you can see how I have to thank Vincent Nee, the Guardian correspondent. I was going to say in Beijing, but not in Beijing at the moment, for sending me this list of articles on the end of China's rise, one from October this year and going back to 2012. So we have this discourse coming back and again and again and again. And I know in the case of Dan Lynch here, again, he was trying to puncture what he thought was an exaggerated discourse of the inevitability of China's rise and an overstatement of Chinese power capacity. And I think some of this dichotomization, if you like, is a consequence of the way that debates over China are perhaps pushing people to extremes. If you want to counter what you think is the dominant narrative, you have to perhaps exaggerate and shout a bit louder than the other side. And if the other side responds in the same way, then you can end up with a discourse that gets dichotomized to loud extremes, and the voices of grey in the middle perhaps get a little bit overlooked and are harder to listen to. And I certainly think that process is taking place in the UK at the moment in a way that it hasn't really taken place so much in the past, that there is an attempt to say, well, what is it? Take sides. Where's your position? But I think it's also a result of different ways of studying China and the different ways, as I said at the beginning, that evidence is sought, understood and used by different academic communities. And I think both of us speaking here today are a little bit odd in some respects, in that we have feet in both the domestic Chinese politics camp, if you like, and also the international relations community, well, people who perhaps straddle a more area studies-based way of understanding China, but also engage with those who are more theoretically inclined and more perhaps prone to start from the grand theories of international relations. And within international relations, there has obviously been a focus on the different consequences of different theoretical starting positions, realism versus liberalism. I've lost count of the amount of introductions to papers that start off with the words Eichenberry and Mearsheimer in about the first 3 or 4 lines, for good reasons. And of course, these different theoretical starting points do take you in different directions, and perhaps your assumptions lead to the conclusions that you have about what China's going to be like and China's role in the global order. But I actually wonder if other starting points are in some ways more significant than this theoretical distinction within international relations scholarship. And I've increasingly begun to think that the first encounter with China seems to me to play some sort of role in establishing your understanding of the nature of the country the units of comparison that you use, and even the questions that you ask and the big issues that you are interested in. And it certainly did for me. So this seems to be a good excuse for me to put up some slides of photos I first took in China in 1984, including from the far southwest and into Inner Mongolia too, simply so that you don't have to look at me for much longer. So I think your first encounter has to have some sort of impact. If you've only ever known China as a big economy, as a major global actor, surely that shapes your starting positions in the way that you think about the country, in ways that if you've had earlier encounters, you perhaps asking other questions. Maybe you're a little bit more aware of some of the vulnerabilities, and your unit of comparison is also very different. I was asked in class this week, because we were looking at the Cultural Revolution, if I thought Xi Jinping really was taking China back to the Cultural Revolution. And my response was, if people say that, it's because they don't know what happened in the Cultural Revolution, because whatever Xi Jinping is doing and wherever he's going, it's not there. So that seemed to me to be important. And where you are seems to make a difference too. Now, let me say that this book that I've written is very much a book that is written by a European from a European perspective. And yes, I am still a European. Despite Brexit, not just because of my Irish passport, but because whatever the British government might want to do, we are still an integral part of Europe. So I do think that there's a difference. You know, if you're writing in China's backyard, then the immediacy of the security challenge is there in perhaps a way that it isn't if you're writing in rural Warwickshire, as I spent most of my time doing. If you're writing in the United States, I wonder whether there's an understanding that there's still a possibility to maybe shape the nature of China's rise that is absent from other parts of the world too. So I think where you're writing from makes a difference. But for me, the key difference, I think the most important difference, is between those who study China from a more inside-out domestic politics, domestic society, domestic cultural starting point, the domestic drivers of what China is doing on the one hand, and those who focus on what we might call the consequences and future of Chinese international interactions from a more international relations disciplinary position on the other side. And this, I think, can often explain, it's not just that there are different conclusions about where China is going, but just very, very different intellectual agendas, very, very different starting points. And actually, at the extremes, those who focus on the domestic and those who focus on the consequence of China at the global level don't really talk to each other at all. They talk past each other. So what I actually wanted to write was this book, as I said, on how we study China, rather than a book on China itself. And hopefully that is still there to an extent. But it's something that I've not given up on, and I've been talking to Chris McAdally about possibly doing something on this in more detail. Oops. And this is just, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail. This is a slide I came up with when I was asked to go and talk about scholarship of China in the UK by the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. And it's an exaggerated, really, distinction between different types of scholarship. But I think it gives some sort of understanding or some sort of broad brush way of thinking how different types of scholarship look for different types of evidence. And they were particularly interested in how history, culture, philosophy, language, literature fitted into different types of scholarship. But also leads to very different predictions of the future too. So, I mean, this was my first major starting point for looking at for the book. And it strikes me that if you have a certain view of the nature of China's political economy, then this influences the way that you understand what Chinese international actors are doing overseas. And I won't get into it here, but I think the debt trap diplomacy argument is a really good example of how, if you think of the Chinese state in a certain way, if you approach the study of China in a certain way, consequence is taken as clear evidence of intent, But if you actually study China in different ways, then perhaps you find different intents behind these consequences. I hope that wasn't too confusing. I seem to say the word consequences an awful lot there. So that was the first sort of driver. So the second one is that over the years, I've been lucky enough to have a number of collaborations with Chinese scholars. I showed that picture at the beginning. I don't know whether you can still see it, of when I used to get the bus home to Fudan University in 2018. And I spent a lot of time in China, including visiting professorships at People's University, at Peking University, the China Foreign Affairs University, the Foreign Ministry, which is a really interesting place to spend a lot of time, and also a couple of times at Fudan in Shanghai. And what I've been able to do, supported by the China National Knowledge Infrastructure, which if you're doing serious research on China, has become an essential source of getting hold of Chinese language academic scholarship, was to spend time thinking about how China's global role, identity, and ambitions are debated within China itself, and how these discourses and debates have changed over time. And this has been really very interesting. One of the issues I think in scholarship that we face at the moment is because of self-censorship, the question of how do you study what isn't being said and isn't being written, and how do you perhaps treat the over-significance of things that are written because they are repeating the preferences and desires of the Chinese leadership. So here's a couple of things that have emerged from those participations in debates over recent years: a special issue of the British Journal of Politics International Relations, and a book that was also a special issue of the Pacific Review. As editor of the Pacific Review, I asked myself if I could do a special issue, and I said I could, and this was the consequences of it. So in combination with being directly involved in some of these discussions and debates, and also through reading Chinese language scholarship, I was able to observe a few things that also inspired the book. One was a big shift in understanding of China's relative power capacities, and a change from either denying China's great power status, or maybe being very skeptical of it, to an increasing acceptance and embracing of it. China might not be the superpower, but the idea that it is a global great power now, I think, is really very clearly established. And that's why I wish I hadn't got the question mark after China risen. The main debate seems not now on whether China is a great power, but exactly how much great power it has, its degree of great powerness, and how do you change the world from second place when the global number one doesn't want you to become the number one. I wanted to call the book, you might remember a famous book called Japan as Number One. I wanted to call it China as Number Two, but I was dissuaded from doing this by the publishers because of a connotation that I'd not actually honestly thought of at the time. But this idea of how to change the world from second place, I think, has become sort of mainstream. You also identify greater confidence that China has something to offer others, both in terms of developmental experiences and solutions to global governance deficits. The idea that all countries are unique, but China is in some way uniquely unique. There's something unique about Chinese uniqueness, and the importance of Chinese wisdom and Chinese national identity as providing the basis not just for solutions to China's problems, but to global problems has become increasingly evident as well. There is a growing discourse of not just exceptionalism, but what I refer to throughout this book as Occidentalism. And this is a process, I think, where you don't so much say what China is, but say what it's not. And what is not is a very negative vision of the West, an aggregated thing called the West. You create a very negative depiction of this other, the West, and China is identified as being everything that the West is not. And the other thing that you identify time and again is the idea of China as defensive and reactive, and basically trying to catch up in a world that isn't of China's making, rather than being proactive or aggressive or assertive. And this, I think, often makes it at times very difficult to find a basis for interaction if the basic starting point of understanding of what China is doing differs from a Chinese side looking out and from an outside perspective looking in. So that resulted in a strong focus in the book on Chinese discourses and Chinese arguments and changing Chinese theories, to the extent that I wonder at times whether I put more coherence on China's some of these discourses than is really there in reality. And I do worry that I've actually created a rationality behind some of the things that Xi Jinping says that perhaps isn't always there in reality, but never mind. So the third thing, and I realize I need to push on for time, is what do we mean by power? And this has got really nothing much to do with power. I just quite like these pictures. So Chinese power is often stated as a given. China is powerful, China's power is this, which is, seems to make some sort of common sense, but it's not clear to me that the word power is often being used with real meaning and precision. What is it that actually brings about observable change in others that they wouldn't otherwise have done? So what I tried to do was break down different dimensions of Chinese power. I mean, the loosest definition of Chinese power for me is the concept of soft power, because I'm not sure, first of all, that the state promotion of a preferred national identity is really soft, but it's become used by different people to refer to such a whole range of things that it loses any intersubjective meaning for me. I mean, people talk about economics and diplomacy as soft power. It makes no sense. But I was very interested in ideational power. I'm not going to call it soft power, but if you like, ideational power, not just what China is doing in terms of what is called soft power, but also the emerging and evolving Chinese normative agendas and challenges to the basis of global governance in some areas, those areas where I think there's been identified as a possibility for either challenging existing normative basis for governance ideas and practice, and in some areas where emerging areas like cybersecurity and outer space, where there isn't already a well-established normative or governance structure. But I'm also interested in the ways that dominant perceptions and narratives of China have shifted quite considerably in a number of places. And one of the things that this has led to is a focus on the gap between the intention of the signaling from China and how those signals are received and understood outside China. And trying to understand why in places like the UK, but not just the UK, such a big transition in the dominant way that China has been spoken about and policy responses at times developed, but also more broadly, it is one of the aims and objectives of the book. But while ideas are important, there is a clear recognition for me that material interactions matter very much too. And what I do in the book is try and make a distinction between market power, productive power, and financial power. And in the latter, I focus on the changing nature of Chinese finance, and again, in particular, how this is impacted on Europe, to try and investigate ways in which China's power can be thought of in ways that actually create a response in others that they might not otherwise have wanted to take. So I realize I'm running out of time, so let me just... So the book really is about trying to provide a couple of bridges, and because it's about a couple of bridges, here are a couple of bridges. One of them over the Yellow River, and the other in, I think that's, is it Beihai? Or it might actually be the Summer Palace. I think it's the Summer Palace. Anyway, so on the one hand, one of the bridges is to try and create a bridge between the study of political economy and more constructivist, ideational ways of thinking about power and about thinking about relationship between friends, enemies, and trust. And I emphasize political economy. There's a massive hole in this book, and that's the military. I really don't know much about the military at all. And I spent quite a long time thinking, should I put something in about the military? I mean, clearly it's important, security and hard power. But one of the challenges that any researcher faces now when they're studying China, when I first started studying China, the paucity of information and the paucity of analysis was the problem. Now, the problem is the oversupply. So trying to keep on top of the things that you're a specialist in is quite difficult. let alone sort of embark on a new area of scholarship that I know nothing about. So I've focused on ideas and political economy, and I've missed off the military. But that's the first bridge between political economy, materialist observations, and more ideational constructivist ones. And the second bridge I've tried to provide is between more inside-out studies of China as a global power, focusing on domestic drivers and domestic debates, and outside-in types of understanding of the consequences of China's rise. And I simply will leave it to you to decide whether I pulled that off or not, and note here that the book is available in paperback, so it's not going to cost you a fortune if you do decide to undertake that task. So I realise I haven't said very much about the substance of the book or the arguments in it, but as I'm increasingly interested in what we might call the sociology of knowledge when it comes to China, then this seems to me to be quite appropriate, and it helps me think about how I move on from the last project, maybe to the next one. This is actually the West Lake in Hangzhou, and it was on National Day 2018. And what you can't see is about 2 million people standing directly behind me because everybody else had gone to the lake on the same day. But it's a nice picture to finish on. And as my old tutor, Tim Gray, used to say when I was an undergraduate, thanks for listening, if you have been.
Thank you so much, Shaun, for that great presentation. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions and more to be discussed in the Q&A. Let's move on now to Liz, who will be talking about her new book, which is also coming out, I think tomorrow, right, in the UK?
Yeah, tomorrow in the UK and then January in the US. So Shaun, I just have to say, I thought that was fascinating. And I honestly didn't find one thing that I disagreed with. In fact, you reminded me, I think, how important it is, the way that we first engage with China. I remember that, so I first engaged through the issue of the environment. And when I was writing my first book on China's environment, I got to know a lot of the NGO activists who were just starting up. So it was the beginning of civil society in China in many respects, and the environment was at the forefront. The US played a pretty important role in terms of engaging and training and political capacity building on the environment in China. And so I've always felt as though, and also there were a lot of protests around the environment later on. And so I always started from the domestic side. And still today, when people are kind of like, there's no point in engaging China, I said, you don't appreciate, how much engagement can help to shape, sort of some aspects of Chinese development. And it's the wrong approach, I think, to just say, forget about engagement. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that I started off, looking, on the ground in China, what was taking place, and the engagement between civil society actors. It is much more difficult today, but nonetheless, it just struck me, I think, how important that point is that you made. Having said that, this book that I've written is really the other kind of book, the outside-in book. It really is about China's role on the global stage, and it's called The World According to China. I started really with just 3 questions that I'd been thinking about that I kind of wanted to answer for myself. First, what is Xi Jinping's ambition for China on the global stage? What is his strategy for realizing that ambition, and is he likely to succeed? And I argue that Xi's ambition is, captured in his notion of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is, in many respects, a concept that speaks to his desire for domestic rejuvenation. But I also think it speaks to that desire to move China to center stage, which he also talks about, which is, I think, about reclaiming China's historic centrality on the global stage. Of course, China already occupies a position of centrality. It is the world's largest trading power, lending source, has the world's largest population in the military. It's a global center of innovation. And most frankly, analysts predict that China's GDP is going to surpass that of the United States by 2030. In addition, any Chinese action, right, on global issues like climate change, pandemics, proliferation, all of those are determinative for the rest of the world. So, I think there's no sense in which China is not, in many respects, central to, what's going on in the world today. But I think Xi's notion of centrality is not about simply ensuring that China's voice is given the weight and influence within the existing international system that its relative power would indicate. I think it's not even about reforming, at the margins, the international system. Instead, I think his vision reflects a pretty radical transformation of the international order and China's place within it. So I'm just going to run through what I think are the sort of the 5 dimensions that across which his vision manifests itself, sort of where he's actively attempting to, as I put it, reorder the world order. I think the first and in some ways the most obvious is that he's trying to redraw the very map of China by moving from staking Chinese claims around sovereignty to realizing that. He has said repeatedly there is no rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation without, he says, reunification. I like to use the word unification. In a speech just last month, he said the historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. In the first instance, unification, I think, means Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, right? The core interests. And with Hong Kong, we've already seen Beijing's imposition of the national security law in 2020 really effectively brought to an end the political and economic autonomy that Hong Kong had enjoyed under the one country, two systems governance model that had been in place since 1997 and was supposed to last until 1947. I think Hong Kong, if it isn't already just another Chinese city, is really well on its way to being so. China's also made progress, I think, in terms of asserting its sovereignty in the South China Sea. Well-known, Beijing claims about 80% of the area. Its claims are contested by 5 other nations: Taiwan, Brunei, Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Since Xi Jinping came to power, Beijing has created and militarized 7 artificial features. It's laid claim to scores of others. He has dramatically, since you didn't talk at all about the military, I will tell you, he has dramatically upgraded the PLA Navy, in fact, all of the armed forces, and their ability to coordinate among themselves. There's a newly armed and quite robust Coast Guard and his vast fishing fleet, all of which China uses to intimidate the other claimants, to assert dominance in disputed waters, do things like start oil and gas production in disputed offshore fields. I thought it was very interesting during the pandemic when other countries were distracted. You saw Xi press China's territorial claims in many other areas around the contested Diaoyu Senkaku Islands off Japan, the Parasols near Vietnam, Malaysian, Indonesian waters and airspace. And of course, Beijing engaged with India in the first armed conflict along the border in 40 years. Biggest outstanding challenge for China right now in terms of Xi's sort of sovereignty narrative is Taiwan. The 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi declared reunification with Taiwan one of the 14 must-do items for China to achieve its great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And this is an issue that provokes a lot of debate in the United States about just how far Xi Jinping is willing to go with regard to reunification with Taiwan. Some people, and I put myself in this camp, believe that there is no more important issue to Xi than sovereignty, and he's willing to tolerate a lot of disequilibrium in the international system to achieve this reunification. And so we should not put aside the notion that Xi Jinping may well take military action as soon as he believes that the PLA could be successful. Others think that that's not what Xi has planned. That's not the direction which China is planning to go. They point to statements that peaceful reunification is still very much in the ether. But I have to say that over the past few years, and all my contacts since my last trip was November of 2019, all my contacts on Zoom with many Chinese colleagues, when I asked them what is the peaceful path to unification with Taiwan, I don't get any real answer. So I'm not sure what that looks like. So. And Xi, I think, has been very strident in his rhetoric overall. He said the island's nation's independent separatism remained the most serious hidden danger to national rejuvenation. And of course, the importance of Taiwan has only increased as a result of its position as the center of the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing. TSMC, which is the crown jewel of Taiwan's semiconductor industry, controls over half of the global market for made-to-order chips. So this has become a new and big issue, not simply about Taiwan's democracy and debates over that, but this issue of the semiconductor one, I can tell you, at least in the States, is a very significant one. But since Tsai Ing-wen came to power as president in Taiwan in 2016, she has undertaken a range of measures designed to coerce Taiwan. And Tsai, and what triggered this was Tsai's refusal to acknowledge the '92 consensus that both Taiwan and the mainland were part of China. That's not the DPP, her party's position. And so we've seen, China cut off long-established cross-strait dialogue, dramatically reduce the number of mainland tourists and students that have been permitted to travel to Taiwan. He resumed the process of buying off Taiwan's diplomatic allies. So has taken them from 22 to I think 15 over the past, I guess 5 years or so now. And of course, we saw during the pandemic that he prevented Taiwan, or China prevented Taiwan, from participating in the World Health Assembly briefings in the early months of COVID-19. Despite all of this, I would note Taiwan hasn't changed its position. Moreover, China's assertiveness around its sovereignty claims, I think, has provoked a pretty strong reaction in the international community. European countries have become more deeply engaged in asserting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The US, UK, and Australia established a new sort of military arrangement, AUKUS. And the US, Japan, Australia, and several countries in Europe have become much more engaged in trying to bolster Taiwan's independent domestic diplomatic status and security. So if you expand then out from this issue of sovereignty to the broader region, I think Xi's second objective in his sort of reordered world order is to become the dominant power in the Asia Pacific. China has called repeatedly for Asia to be governed by Asians. She stresses sort of the common historical, cultural, economic ties. China's worked hard to support regional economic and security arrangements that don't include the United States. Some of them the United States simply hasn't entered, like the CPTPP, but others, I think, more deliberately have excluded the US. China also, many officials call for the dissolution of US security alliances. They call them anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, and anti-China. I think China's success here, too, is quite mixed. I think Beijing has clearly cemented itself as the dominant economic player in the region. Although importantly, Japan is a larger source of investment than China is in Asia, which many people find surprising. But China is certainly the larger trading power. But here again, I think China's military assertiveness throughout the Asia Pacific has prompted a strengthening rather than a dissipation of the US alliance system in the region. The third dimension of Xi's strategy is to ensure that other countries' policy choices reflect Chinese values, norms, and interests. And I think this includes a wide array of different types of state-directed efforts. So I'm just going to tick off a couple. I think the most notable is certainly the Belt and Road Initiative, which Xi Jinping launched in 2013. Everybody knows it began as a hard infrastructure program that was designed to export overcapacity, connect lesser developed parts of the country to export markets, and to help fill the global infrastructure gap. It's morphed and evolved. There's a digital Silk Road that has undersea cables and e-commerce and the Beidou satellite system, as well as cloud computing and many, many other Chinese technologies now. There's the Health Silk Road, which really came to fruition during the pandemic, became a vehicle for China to export traditional Chinese medicine, also sort of e-health technologies and medical devices. And there's a Polar Silk Road, where we've seen China investing or trying now to invest pretty aggressively in the Arctic region and preparing itself for the day when all the glaciers melt and the distance between China and Europe is reduced by a matter of weeks, and many new natural resources emerge for the taking. There's also a political and security component to the Belt and Road. China offers political capacity building in much the same way that the United States and Europe traditionally offered political capacity building, but with a slightly different twist. So China will offer cybersecurity training seminars. Tanzania, Vietnam have modeled their cyber laws after that of China. Tanzania learned how to do real-time censorship of the internet, training with Chinese officials. Tanzania is actually a pilot country for Chinese political capacity building in Africa. Some countries like South Africa, the ANC has done party training, how to strengthen party and how to strengthen party grassroots relations with the Chinese Communist Party. And the Belt and Road is a conduit for Chinese soft power, which I take to mean, since Shaun, you raised this, I take to mean sort of the ability of a country's ideas and culture to attract others. And so, we've seen, for example, 10,000 Villages program in Kenya that the company Star Times has pursued, where they're providing not only the sort of satellite TVs for all the people in these villages, but also they've dubbed 100,000 hours of Chinese language programs. So kung fu films and dramas about Chinese life that from all accounts are proving very appealing. And China also established its first military logistics base in Djibouti. And I think it's worth noting that this represented a really fundamental shift in China's traditional sort of claims around sovereignty. But China, for the longest time, always said, we will never have an overseas base. We will never be like the United States. And yet, it did establish its first base with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think there are more bases that are likely to come, with Cambodia, Tanzania, and the UAE as likely places. But the Belt and Road has become bumpy. It's basically the wholesale export of China's development model, right? The benefits of rapid infrastructure-led economic development with all the same attendant externalities: corruption, rising levels of debt, environmental pollution and degradation, labor issues. There are popular protests around Belt and Road projects in virtually every country where there are projects. And we have host countries that are trying to renegotiate terms, many projects being canceled. And overall, we've seen a downward trend, a pretty steady diminution in Chinese investment in the Belt and Road since 2016. Interestingly, too, when I was doing the research for the work, for the book, one of the things that I thought I would see is that the levels of Belt and Road investment, so how much money China put into countries, would actually translate into support from those countries for Chinese positions on sort of contentious issues. Because you often hear how Greece and Hungary, for example, held up consensus votes on human rights issues for the EU when it came to China, and it was because of Chinese investment. But what I found is that if you look at the top countries that are receiving Belt and Road investment and look at their support for China in areas like the South China Sea and Xinjiang and Hong Kong, that when these issues come to the United Nations, for example, there is no strict correlation between the amount of Belt and Road investment and countries' support for China on those positions. Confucius Institutes, I think, are another very well-known example of Chinese efforts to spread their influence and enhance their soft power. Their primary objective is teaching Chinese language, sharing Chinese culture. But I think, the appeal of them has begun to diminish. The Confucius Institutes proliferated very rapidly at the outset, but there was always a sort of coercive undertone to the initiative. In 2011, Politburo standing member Li Changchun stated, "The Confucius Institute is an appealing brand for expanding our culture abroad. It has made an important contribution toward improving our soft power. The Confucius brand has a natural attractiveness. Using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable." And over time, I think, the terms of the Confucius Institutes that China enforced raised some questions about the integrity of the enterprise among scholars and politicians. So per Beijing's requirements, contracts with CIs remained sealed. Teachers and curriculum were determined by Beijing. These were kinds of concessions that most universities would not make to any other type of outside partnership. In addition, in a few cases, there was evidence that CIs tried to shape sort of broader university policy around China-related issues, for example, warning against hosting the Dalai Lama. In the end, and I think this is kind of important, if you look, China set a goal of having 1,000 CIs by 2020, but today they stand at just slightly above 540. I think there are several messages that come out of that are probably worth discussing. China also, of course, deploys much more overtly coercive strategies to shape other countries' behavior. It's wolf warrior diplomats, weaponized PPE, personal protective equipment during the pandemic, threatening to cut off supplies to countries that criticized it. When Australia called for an investigation into the origins of the virus, Beijing initiated a widespread boycott of some of Australia's most popular goods. None of this is really new. China has long used the leverage of its market to try to coerce actors to align their positions with those of China. In the United States, I would say a particularly important example of Chinese coercive behavior was when the Houston Rockets general manager tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And Beijing responded by pulling the Rockets branded products from shelves, and CCTV came out and said, "We believe that any remarks that challenge national sovereignty and social stability are not within the scope of freedom of speech." I think for many Americans, that was really a wake-up call. Virtually anything in the minds of the current Chinese leadership, I would argue, could be seen as challenging social stability. And so what they were signaling, in effect, was that any comment made anywhere on any platform, including one like Twitter, which isn't openly available to Chinese citizens, people could be expected to be punished for a comment like that. And as Amy mentioned, of course, journalists have been expelled. The Wall Street Journal, after it published a piece with the title describing China as the sick man of Asia, had several of its journals expelled. What I discovered when I was looking at these cases of coercive behavior on the part of China is that while the actions tend to be fairly effective at shaping the behavior of independent actors like multinationals, they are not effective at changing the behavior of countries. So whether it's the Philippines or Australia or South Korea, Sweden, the Netherlands, whatever, when China has boycotts against countries, attempts to change behavior that way, generally the countries do not fold. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly just outline the last two objectives. I think the fourth objective of Xis has really been just to re-engineer the nature of China's economic engagement with the rest of the world. Broadly speaking, I would just describe it as nationalizing and insulating the Chinese economy within the context of remaining a superpower in a globalized economy. So trying to have this cake and eat it too. I think we're right in the midst now. We can see the type of crackdown that's happening in many sectors, basically anything having to do with sort of online business, from the fintech to insurance, gaming, whatever it is. But I think there are a couple of implications of this, sort of the greater control that the CCP has taken in private companies in China, I think has made it more difficult for many Chinese companies when they go out, because it's very difficult for the rest of the world to discern what is a private company in China and what is a state-directed company. There's very little faith that any Chinese company could stand up to the Chinese government and just, say no. And I think that it's also producing a push now for greater reshoring and friendshoring in many other countries. Sort of their countries feel that there's too great a reliance on the Chinese supply chain, and they've become concerned about the reliability of that, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. Finally, I think on the economic side, that this crackdown that we're seeing now on the tech front, is likely to limit the ability of China to expand globally, and also for opportunities for foreign investors to engage in China. But we'll have to wait to see. Okay, last point is, and I think Shaun, began to touch on this, is that Xi has called for China to lead in the reform of the global governance system. He has made clear that he doesn't believe that the current rules-based order reflects adequately China's voice or the voice of many countries in the developing world, that this rules-based order was created and perpetuated for the advantage of a small number of liberal market democracies. And he wants the values and norms embedded in these institutions to reflect Chinese priorities. And I'll just finish by saying, I think, this manifests itself in two different ways. The first is in sort of short-term Chinese tactics. So, if you look at Chinese behavior in international institutions, for example, in the United Nations, you often find that Chinese officials use their positions to advance more narrow Chinese interests. for example, embedding the Belt and Road Initiative in 24 UN programs and agencies. You may think this is innocuous, but in fact, China threatened to block reauthorization of the UN mission to Afghanistan in 2019 if the BRI weren't included in the language of the reauthorization. It didn't happen. The rest of the countries didn't agree, but it's a very coercive approach. In other cases, Chinese officials have blocked people. Chinese officials in the International Civil Aviation Organization have blocked people who tweeted in support of membership for Taiwan. I interviewed Dolphin Issa, who's one of the world's leading Uyghur activists, who was physically prevented from speaking before the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2017, even though he was registered to do that and he had his UN badge. They literally the UN guards came into the hall and physically removed him from the UN. And later, Wu Hongbo, who is a Chinese official serving as undersecretary for the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, claimed responsibility for blocking Issa's appearance on Chinese television. He said, "We have to strongly defend the motherland's interests." There have also been, there was not any mystery about what happened there, proudly proclaiming it. But there are also longer term, strategies for transforming broader norms in areas like internet governance, human rights, technical standards, and the Arctic. And I look at some of those in the book. So I will end here on the question of whether she will succeed. I come down as mixed. I basically think that what's happening is an effort to almost graft China's political model onto the current international system, that is the sort of the result of the policies that China is currently pursuing, but that fundamentally these two models are incompatible, and that what we're seeing now is a kind of pushback. The harder that Xi Jinping pushes the model onto the system, I think the greater the pushback is going to be. And if he doesn't modify his ambition or maybe reform his strategy, I think he's going to fall short of realizing his ambition. Thank you, and sorry for going on a bit too long.
No, thank you so much, Liz, for that very interesting discussion. I think you raised a lot of points. I just wanted to remind everyone listening that if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to DM me. You can do it anonymously and let me know if you want to be anonymous. We've received a few questions already, so keep them coming. I guess my first question for the two of you is sort of I would like you just to sort of grapple with the title of this panel, which is, I think both of you sort of touched on it to begin with, but it's China has arrived as a global superpower. Shaun, you said that China is not the superpower, but is a global power right now. But I'd love to hear more your thoughts from both of you on whether you think that is China a superpower? If so, why? If not, what would it take to get there?
Well, as Liz has to go, I believe, in not too long. Do you want to take it first, Liz, and then I'll chip in afterwards?
Sure. I think, from my perspective, my book is called The World According to China. I don't think there's any mystery about where I stand in terms of China being a global power. I think China has arrived, as I said, even, looking at just the metrics of what we would consider to be traditional, measures of power, like the size of its economy and the size of its military, the size of its population, et cetera, its role as the largest, trading power in the world, its impact on all those global challenges that I mentioned. I think there's no doubt that China is a global power. I guess maybe for me, the question that the issue that I didn't touch on in my remarks that maybe is worth addressing, that I think, feeds into what your question is, Amy, is whether China wants to replace the United States as the world's sort of sole superpower, global hegemon. And I come down, at least for now, on the side of saying no. And I do think China wants to replace the United States in the Asia Pacific, but I don't think China is actually prepared to shoulder the burdens of global leadership. And I think the evidence for this, I think, is just in the past 4 years. with the Trump administration sort of stepping back, right, pulling the United States out of all sorts of international arrangements and institutions, and basically saying, yeah, we're not interested in leading anymore. I can't tell you how many newspaper articles were written, and I'm sure you didn't write any of them, maybe, but how many were written that said, China ready to step into the vacuum of US leadership, I wrote a piece saying that's not going to happen, right? And of course, it did not happen, right? You didn't see China step up and talk about how they were going to forge a new global agreement on climate change that dealt with methane emissions, right? You haven't seen China step up into that reach. China tends still to pursue a narrower set of its own interests, even when, and I'll make this the last point, even in the United Nations, it's funny, when it makes large donations to programs, right? So it'll say, okay, we're going to give $2 billion to support, COVID-19 relief. It isn't this exact one. I have a case in my book, and I can't remember right now what exactly it was. But basically what you find is that they put like 5 Chinese officials are in charge of dispersing that money that now is in the United Nations, right? And that like a third of the projects come back to feed into like Belt and Road projects. So it all becomes this kind of, excellent, they get all the positive publicity. But in the end, a lot of what happens is sort of designed, to serve Chinese interests. It doesn't mean that there can't be coincidence of interest, right? But I haven't seen China yet really step up in a significant way on any global issue to say, we're gonna be the ones to structure this new agreement, and we're gonna bring everybody on board. It has done that in the region, but not on the international stage.
Yeah, very boringly. I agree with that. I mean, it would be much more interesting if I didn't. But I mean, I'm not sure about the word superpower. I think we've got to be a little bit careful. We seem to be thinking about the future using language and terminology designed to explain a different type of past, actually. And I'm a little bit wary about searching back for the Cold War and the old period of bipolarity for sort of for our dictionary to try and explain where we are now and where we're going in the future. I mean, certainly a great power, yeah, absolutely. Superpower, I'm not so sure. I think China's leaders' main objective is to rule China rather than rule the world, right? I think what they want is to be able to rule China in the way that they want to, free from let, hindrance, even comment from anybody else. And if this entails creating dominance in their own backyard, as I think it does, then that's part of it. If it means diminishing the ability of others to impose their preferences and values as the standard for forms of governance and the way benchmarks against which China might be judged, then I think for the time being, that's probably good enough. It doesn't have to be a case of replacing liberal values with the new Chinese world order. Diminishing the appeal and power and ability of others to impose the liberal world order is probably good enough. And a lot of what is said in terms of China's sort of ambitions for a new global order, community of shared future for humankind, well, it's very difficult to sort of disagree with, right? I mean, who wouldn't want a world where all problems are resolved by dialogue and conversation and equity, really? I mean, I guess the real challenge, and this comes back to what Liz is saying, is that it's all well and good saying that, but what happens when that doesn't work? Well, what happens when A's got B by the throat and they won't solve their problems by diplomacy and discussion? What happens when A or B has got you by the throat and neither of you are prepared, or your core interests conflict with the core interests of others? So I think, yes, a great power, yes, the ability to make countries do what they wouldn't otherwise want to do. I think for the time being, undermining the power and authority of the alternative is good enough. But one thing that I think we need to focus on is followership rather than just potential leadership, because it's not the yellow brick road. You can't click your heels 3 times and wish you were back in Kansas. You can't click your heels 3 times and wish you were a global leader. You have to take people along with you if you're going to become a global leader. You have to be able to develop followership. And there is some followership for China, right? There is in some places. The example that you used about Africa is a very good one. But one of the consequences of what we might call the soft power agenda in some parts of the world is to harden positions against China, to actually make people more skeptical and more questioned. So yes, a great power, but I'm not sure about superpower, and one that I still think has a long way to go before there's a very clearly articulated vision of what Chinese great power ambitions are for others rather than just China, and also a long way to go before it gets the sort of followership that that others needed, I think, to really cement yourself as a sustainable great power over the long run.
Thank you. And we're going to move now to some questions that people have submitted. I think this would be great for Liz and Shaun, if you wanted to jump in after, feel free. It's about climate. Obviously, we had the climate summit recently. We have Levi Westerveld asking, how will China approach these issues of COP26 and the tripartite nature crisis, waste, biodiversity, and climate internationally? Will China and the West be able to work together on these issues? And relatedly, what is your view on China's absence from the recent climate summit, and what does this mean for global environmental efforts?
Okay, great. So it's interesting. I myself have been trying to puzzle out why Xi Jinping isn't traveling. And, people are kind of like, oh, well, because it's, 3 weeks of, quarantine. I'm like, yeah, Xi Jinping does not need to quarantine for 3 weeks when he comes back to China if he doesn't want to. He's not going down to that giant facility in Guangdong, right? I'm wondering whether or not he feels like he has to be there because things are so unsettled. So I would be actually really interested, Amy and Shaun, your opinions on this, because it's just been something I haven't been able to, I don't feel like I have a firm grasp on why he didn't attend the climate change summit. And because it's, generally speaking, he loves these kinds of events. He uses them to make very big announcements to sort of set himself up as a leader. Again, I think delivery is often a little bit less than what the initial pronouncements suggest. But generally speaking, she likes a big party better than almost anyone I know. The fact that he didn't show up, I don't think that it's actually, I don't think that it's determinative in terms of what happens moving forward in terms of cooperation or even in terms of China's contribution. China made a big move when it said that it wasn't going to export coal-fired power plants anymore through the Belt and Road Initiative. That had been a kind of a big black mark against them. And now Xi Jinping has pledged not to do that anymore. So I think that's really important. I think what people are waiting to see and which he has promised to deliver are really all the benchmarks, right? So, she has said that China will, peak CO2 emissions in 2030, to be carbon neutral by 2060. The US, other countries would like China to move to 2050, which is where many other countries are. They've proved a little resistance so far. That might have been an area, for example, where if the relationship between the United States and China were a bit better, you might have had some traction on that. But I think what people are waiting for really is how is China going to achieve that 2030 peak emissions? Can it actually happen a little bit more aggressively? You may recall a few years back, there was all this enthusiasm. People were kind of saying, oh, China's going to beat the 2030 deadline. Well, in fact, that's unlikely to happen. I think a few cities have announced they're going to try to peak in 2025. But I think we can see also with the way that the energy system is still managed in China. So where you have like the localities are just burning up coal and fossil fuels for like 9 months of the year, and then all of a sudden they realize they're not meeting their targets, and you have these massive power shortages. So I think it's an area where the U.S. is John Kerry, who's our special representative on climate, is bound and determined to find real cooperation with China on climate change. And he is consumed, I have to say, with this. So I'm not completely pessimistic about the opportunity for China to get on board with slightly more aggressive action and for there to be some form of semi-meaningful cooperation between the US and China on this issue.
Great. I think we have time for one more question for Liz, and then Shaun, you can answer that as well, but then we'll let Liz go after she answers. I think there have been a few questions about, what might be some factors in a collapse of China. Would it be, Chen Donglan asks, what internal obstacles might cripple China's steps to rise, aging, the collapse of population, inflation and inequality, real estate industry? And also Johannes Lone Steensgaard from University of Oslo asks, what are, in your eyes, the biggest causes, catalysts for a potential Chinese collapse that you mentioned? Have some been resolved? Have some new arisen that we should look out for? I think that was addressed to Shaun, but I think, Liz, maybe you can tackle that first, and then we can move on from there.
Sure. So just to be clear, I did not write the book, The Coming Collapse of China, like Gordon Chang. That was supposed to happen. When was that supposed to happen again? I forget, 2001 or 10, or I don't even know anymore. But you look, I think, Roger Garside actually has a new book out that talks about this issue. And I broadly agree with his framing, which is to say, if you were to have a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy, sort of, you already have a lot of polarization in the system, I would argue, and again, Amy and Shaun, would be really interesting to hear your perspectives on this, but it's funny when I've been looking at China, inside China, and again, from the US at this point, I've been struck by sort of the, gender issues in China, obviously ethnic issues, polarization, income inequality. Yes, that's something that Xi Jinping is trying to address, as we speak. And then I think a kind of divide among what I've called like the bureaucratic class and the creative class, right? Entrepreneurs, intellectuals, people for whom sort of freedom of thought is kind of essential to their success in their work, right? To be able to be creative, outside boundaries. And that, there's, I think, probably some significant discontent that we don't necessarily see, but that is burbling under the surface. So is it possible that with a really significant economic slowdown, with all of the sort of contentiousness in many respects, the headwinds that Xi Jinping has created for China on the global stage, right? The fact that you're going to have an entirely new military alliance established between US, Australia, and the UK, I mean, there have to be some criticisms of what Xi Jinping is doing here, right? The kind of backlash that has ensued with so many of his policies. Could you have some kind of fracture in the sort of top elite that would cause Xi Jinping, to be pushed back to the second line, like what happened to Mao Zedong after the Great Leap Forward, right? Could that happen? I think it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I'm not predicting any kind of collapse. I'm not even predicting a regime transition, but I'm just sort of playing out how something like that might happen.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Liz for joining us today. I know you have to run, but it's been fascinating to hear your thoughts on this topic. Obviously, we could go on for many more hours, but we'll just have to leave it at that. So thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks so much, Amy. It's great to see you and Shaun both. Bye.
Shaun, would you like to tackle that question?
I mean, I don't think it's going to collapse either. I think my focus on the problems would be to suggest that there are assumptions of a continued inevitable path of the problem, I think, rather than this idea that there's going to be an impending sort of collapse into the sea or whatever. In addition to the sort of, I think, the only way I really understand what Xi Jinping has done is to understand that he looked at China in 2010, 11, 12 as he was taking power and thought that a number of things were, if not broken, then getting close to breaking point. One was the nature of the economic system, that the economic model had done very well so far, but was coming to the end of its useful shelf life and had been creating a number of problems, the ones that Liz has just been referring to in particular. The leadership was trying to sort of deal with even before the global financial crisis came along. And then the global financial crisis, the response to it actually exacerbated that. The amount of debt. I mean, if you find a local government in China that's not facing financial problems, and I mean really local, not the provincial ones, but going down to the town and county, township and county level, there's huge financial problems. The whole way the financial system is structured, to me, is really unsustainable, right? And I think actually just getting local government financing right would be a key issue. But there's one issue that could really affect the middle classes, is if property prices continue to rise, then that's a problem. But if property prices fall and collapse, then that's an even bigger problem because people end up in huge amounts of negative equity. So changing the economic model, dealing with inequality, the whole point, when at the last Party Congress, when Xi Jinping changes the primary contradiction, and it's not done very often, the whole point of that is saying that there's a problem with the economy now that we need to severely shift. I think he looked at the party internally and thought that the party was corrupt. It didn't have any coherence, didn't have anything binding it together, and it needed to be unified and brought back into line around a common set of ideas, which just happened to be his. He thought the relationship between the party and the people had become fractured as well, and hence one of the emphases on corruption, although attacking corruption serves other purposes too. But he saw that was I think, stretched. And he also, I think, looked at Chinese society and thought that was broken, that there was no commonality, there was no common purpose, there was no unifying force. It became individualistic, self-serving. And I say this not just through outside observations, I say this through reading the things that Xi Jinping himself has said. And he has looked and studied what happened to the Soviet Union. And I think he doesn't take the CCP's continued grip on power for granted. So there's a whole range of issues, but I would put them in the bracket of domestic problems that could really, that mean a continued upward linear rise is really unlikely, and some sort of inward turn towards a more inward focus, which I think we've seen to a little bit as well, is more likely. I mean, crash, and I just don't see where the alternatives come from at the moment, right?
I have a question from Robert Rust. For Shaun, you said you feel that one's opinion on China, how you view it, depends heavily on the first interaction or intro to China. Since most people are introduced to this way through the media, do you feel that this introduction has shifted to become more hostile in recent years as China has increased its political economic competition globally?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? I think the answer to that, I mean, all I can say is that, I spend a lot of time in China, but, the papers that I read, I'm in the UK. And what I can say is that the general tone of the discourse and debate about China in the UK has shifted very considerably over the last, really since 2016. I mean, and maybe that's in part a reflection of the change in government, where a very sort of pro-China George Osborne, who effectively, I think, was running UK's China policy, stepped down after the government lost the Brexit vote. But there has been an increased focus on the negative and directly negative consequences of the impact of China's rise, or the potentially negative consequences of China's rise. I think the sort of debates that had probably been taking place in the US for longer, and I think there was a degree of contagion as well. What happened in Australia had some sort of impact, and you see the same thing in certainly in the Netherlands and Germany and other parts of Europe. I don't know what it's like in Norway, to be honest, but that has changed, and it's very interesting. I mean, if you went onto the streets in the UK and asked people, how much of the UK economy does China own, I bet you'd get figures in the 10s, 20s, perhaps even higher percent. It's actually tiny, I mean, China owns something like 0.1% of the total stock of foreign investment in the UK. Okay, it's a relatively new player, but even on an annual basis, I think 2019, the last year we got figures for, it was 9th in terms of the number of investments, and I think perhaps even lower than that in the amount of money. And even if you add all the investment from Hong Kong onto it, it's still considerably less than the money that comes from Japan or India. India is often a bigger investor in the UK than China is. So the tone of the threat and the challenge seems to be running ahead of the reality of the direct consequences of economic interactions, and perhaps largely because of what's happened in Hong Kong, and also the reporting of what some of us knew was going on for a while in Xinjiang seemed to sort of become more popularized. So yes, I do think that's had an impact.
And Halvor, sorry if I'm with names, Elfring from University of Oslo says it makes sense that China would like to keep order in their own country first and then regionally. As their ability increases, is there any reason to believe they would not be interested in larger world power, even hegemony?
Yeah, because it's expensive, right? It's not something that is very easy to do. You can't just sort of wave a wand. Providing global public goods isn't an easy thing to do, and it's an expensive thing to do, and at times can lead to doing things that you can't do things at home that you would prefer to do. So, I mean, there might come a period, I know that there are people in China who think that the natural consequence of being a rising power is when you've risen to the top, you impose your sort of value system on the world. But it's not something that is easily done or lightly done or done on the cheap. It's something that is, I mean, look at the way that people often view the United States and what it's doing in terms of provision of global public goods. So greater provision of global public goods, yes. Greater challenges to existing global governance structures where China thinks that it and others don't have sufficient voice and weight, yes. More desire and ability to provide alternatives if change isn't coming about, yes. Some areas where China is prepared to provide new normative challenges to existing sort of norms and the basis of global governance, yes. But that's still a big step away, I think, from imposing global hegemony. But I was wrong about Xi Jinping, so don't listen to me.
Heidi asks, Elizabeth Economy spoke about topics where Beijing holds very strong positions. Could you say some more on the possibilities and the challenges associated with using Chinese academic scholarship as a source when studying such topics, for example, the BRI? This question is inspired by, Shaun, your statements about studying what is not written and scholarship that above all parrots official positions in Chinese academic publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky having, been going to China for quite a long time and having hosted Chinese academics, and they've hosted me, and been involved in collaborative projects, and you get to know people and perhaps have conversations that aren't always very easy to have if you don't have that long sort of level of background and trust. And one of the things that has become clear, I mean, what one academic said to me, well, why are you reading that stuff? Why are you taking that seriously? People are only saying that because that's the way they have to get grants. And I go, well, what am I meant to do? Am I meant to read what's not published? So I think the best you can do is build, if you like, an understanding of the context in which scholarship is taking place, build an understanding of which think tanks and research institutions have which specific lines and who they're associated with. Try and embed your reading of what is being written within that wider context, and understand that, however, that while it might be a partial, perhaps it's more reflective of the nature of the political system than it is the nature of the truly held feelings of every Chinese scholar. That is important in itself, that it's reflective of a certain viewpoint. And what I found in one of the chapters where I go into detail about the Chinese scholarship on the China solution, for example, 中国方案, which is an odd translation actually, because it should mean program, but anyway, is if it does reflect and echo the words and the ideas of certain Chinese leaders or officials or think tanks, that in itself is significant. So you have to do the best that you can, and I think really think in terms of contextualizing what you're reading in the way that you should do when you read anything, to be quite frank. I mean, even if things are written by think tanks in the West, it's important to think about that think tank's position and the message that it's trying to get across, right? So we need to be a little bit street savvy, I think, when we're reading anything, irrespective. I have biases myself. They're obviously reflected in that book. I think I'm honest about those biases and in the book, but when you're reading it, you should be aware of them.
Gloria Joe asks, Liz mentioned that the influence of Confucius Institutes is diminishing. So what do you think the reason is for the failure of China's intention to spread its soft power this way?
Well, the first thing to say is I think we have to make a big distinction between the response to different initiatives in different parts of the world, right? And I, again, make that point in the book. I'm writing as a European, observing these things from Europe, not from Latin America or Africa or other parts of the world, right? So that in mind, because there does seem some evidence that China's soft power initiatives do get more purchase in other parts of the world. I think the problem was that it was being promoted by the Chinese state. And because people had a certain view of the Chinese state, then anything that the Chinese state was going to do was going to be perceived as having a certain rationality behind it. So as I've jokingly suggested once before, if the Chinese state offered everybody in the world free ice cream for the day, then people might complain about Chinese ice cream hegemony. So I think, irrespective of what has actually been done in Confucius Institutes, and I've spoken at Confucius Institutes in the UK and in Finland and in Belgium and in the Netherlands and probably other places too that I've forgotten about, never been told what to say or never been asked not to say certain things. The problem is that the suspicion, the lack of trust in things that are promoted by the Chinese state means that they are passed and understood in certain ways. And so it makes it very, very difficult for Confucius Institutes not to do anything, because one thing that is done in one place will have resonance, and things have been done in some places, right, that do seem to breach being universities, for example, commitments to freedom of expression and academic freedom. But I just think that this is why one of the reasons I don't think calling it soft power is very useful, because it's identified as being a state-led, state-funded project to try and establish a preferred idea of what China actually is and does. And so even if people are just teaching, Chinese language in Confucius classrooms, the lack of trust, I think, that exists now in Chinese leaders' intentions mean that so many things that can be done, or that are done by even individual Chinese, are passed and perceived through this spectacle of lack of trust. And I think, one consequence of that is I think there are real potential problems that just normal Chinese citizens going about their normal business are perhaps mistrusted in some places, in some ways, in very unfortunate ways.
That's actually related to the next question from Erland Wall. How can China continue to be integrated into the world in various ways after the events of the last 2 years, which has produced a lot of skepticism and fear from Western democracies?
It's true, isn't it? It's hard. It's a very hard question, and I've never been more. I mean, Liz was talking about Taiwan and reunification or unification, and I've never been more pessimistic about that than I am at the moment. And it is difficult, and it's very hard to build trust and very easy to lose it, particularly if people are wary of the trust building exercises in the first place. But one of the things, so I don't know whether you feel this, Amy, but when you're in China, the China that you live in doesn't always seem to be the same China that you're writing about or reading about, right? I mean, because when you're reading and writing about it, you focus on what China's leaders want and what China's policies and grand strategies. And when you're living there, people are complaining about their husbands and wives, or their sons and daughters, or their parents, or wondering where they're going to go and eat, and the price of accommodation, and being normal, not surprisingly, having those normal human being conversations that human beings tends to have around the world. And I think one of the problems of the last 2 years is because we haven't been able to have those same levels of interactions with sort of daily life China. All we've been left to focus on really is the big picture, politics. So, I mean, I've been saying this for years and years and years, that the more I think that more people can interact with each other, I can't see it doing any harm. Whether that's enough to break through these questions, these big questions of mistrust and concern, I really don't know. One thing that might have some impact at the margins is to think about the way in which tweets are tweeted. And I've got this theory, right? I think that when representatives of the Chinese Foreign Ministry are out on Twitter, they think they're punching up. They think they're a less powerful China punching up at those that are above them. But other people are looking at these and think that it's China punching down, a powerful China punching down. And that explains why things are done and said that seem odd, given the message that China seems to want to be creating. So maybe take a step back and recognize that as a global power, the things you say and how you say them have much more relevance and impact than they did when you were still a developing economy and a rising power.
Well, on that note, I think we will have to end this session. Thank you so much, Shaun, for sharing your thoughts with us today and for talking with us. I think it was extremely fruitful, and we could go on for a long time, but unfortunately we have to end here. I just wanted to plug quickly the next event in the China Seminar Series. There will be discussion on December 1st called Chinese Roads of Communication, Narratives of Connectivity, about the BRI, which I think will be very interesting. And thank you so much to the University of Oslo, to Siv and Heidi for making this possible today. And yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to Oslo. I think this is a great initiative and a fantastic lineup of people, me accepted, of course, obviously. It's something that I wish you all the best for in the future. Bye-bye.